Date with a Debut is recorded and produced on Awabakal country. Always was, always will be, Aboriginal land.
It's been a long time coming. It's, it was a story that's taken many lives, and it's been something that's just hung in there as something that I've wanted to tell for such a long time. And I guess I wrote it as, the voice that I probably wanted to hear when I was going through it. And so it's really satisfying and rewarding that it's actually out in the world.
Welcome to Date with a Debut, a podcast about debut authors, their incredible books, and their journeys to publication. If you are looking for a new author to discover or writing inspiration for your own story and you don't know where to start, this is the place to be. I'm Nick Wasiliev, host of the show, and I'm delighted to welcome another debut author in today's episode. You can find any books mentioned in today's podcast down in the description. We will discuss mild spoilers ahead, so I recommend you grab yourself a copy of the book now, or at least very soon. Wherever you are listening, thank you for listening with us and supporting the Australian book industry, and if you enjoy the show, hit us with a review, a rating, or a thumbs up wherever you get your podcasts. Lastly, this episode is brought to you by Podpixels, the ultimate storytelling tool for passionate podcasters. More on them later in the show. Today's episode of Date with a Debut comes with a small trigger warning. This book and interview contains topics of mental health, self-harm, sexual assault, domestic abuse, and fertility issues. If these are issues that affect you or might be a trigger, there are many resources available which I will link to in the description, but among them, you can contact 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732, Beyond Blue on 1300-224-636, or LifeLine on 13 11 14. You can also contact PANDA on 1300 726 306. Help is available. Hey everybody, it's Date with the Debut time. Nick Wasiliev here, recording on Warramai country, host of Date with the Debut. And for today's episode, we are diving into an incredible memoir about the power of resilience and transformation. For today, I chat with an incredible woman, the founder of Egg Donation Australia and Australians Against Domestic Violence. She has helped create 23 babies for 14 families through egg donation and surrogacy, and today she works at a refuge supporting families facing domestic violence. The one and only Melissa Sharman, whose memoir, The Beauty of Broken Things, cataloguing her incredible life, has been published by the wonderful folks over at Hawkeye Publishing. You can get that down in the description box at your local bookstore. You can check it out at your local library. Needless to say, this podcast comes with several major trigger warnings as mentioned above. But the best way to talk about these topics is directly and honestly. And joining me all the way from beautiful Meanjin country, Melissa, welcome to Date with the Debut.
Oh, thanks, Nick.
It's so nice to have you here. And at the time of us talking, this book has been out for just shy of 2 weeks out in the world. I've seen some of the reviews. I've seen some of the reactions before I dove into it myself. First of all, as a kind of a softball opener, how does it feel to see this story out there reaching other people? Because I'd imagine you would have gotten some amazing reactions to this story.
It's been a long time coming. It's more words than I wrote on the cutting room floor, as is the publishing process. But it was a story that's taken many lives, and it's it's been something that's just hung in there as something that I've wanted to tell for such a long time. And I guess I wrote it as the voice that I probably wanted to hear when I was going through it. And so it's really satisfying and rewarding that it's actually out in the world, and I'm getting some beautiful responses to it. So I'm very happy.
I will say, I can see that it did take on many different lives in many different forms because, and this is a kind of a craft question I love to always ask, but I think what really drew me into this book is your writing is beautiful. It's metaphor laden. It's filled with wonderful imagery. And the word it dances, which the reader and writer in me tips my hat to you about that. And it's also, we were talking about it just before we started recording, but it's a kind voice that you have on the page. You are diving into some very, very dark territory in this story, and yet there is a matter of factness to it. It is honest. it is unguarded, and it made me just want to keep reading and reading and reading. And there's also actually a section in this book where you kind of also dive into journaling, and writing was a key part of the process for you. And I often like to ask authors who've come on the show, where do books and reading sit for you? But instead, I kind of want to ask, how much did writing help with your process of coming to this end point that is the end of this story and is reflected in this title, The Beauty of Broken Things?
I think it's been a beautiful sort of a little recap, ability to sort of, write what I feel and, to have something that's really complete. And I think that writing it is a bit of a process. And I love this quote. I'm hoping I've attributed correctly, but Anne Lamott, where it says, "You write to know what you think." And initially I started writing as a little bit of therapy. I had a story to tell. There wasn't whole bits of it. There was a whole chunks of my life that I wasn't ready to put on paper. And so it was a very patchwork quilt. So I'd write bits and bits and bits and bits, and then gradually at the end join them together. And, and I think as I read other writers' work, and I found that some of the most brutal, honest stuff was what was the most helpful to me. When people just shared their very bare, naked thoughts on what was happening to them, I really felt less alone. So I wanted to be able to do that as well. And the kindness, I think, has come with time. And it's also come with, I've worked in as a domestic violence practitioner, still do, and also in suicide prevention. And I would see clients with so much anger at themselves for not leaving or just not doing well. And I would often flip that around on them. And I would say, if I was sitting here in front of you and I told you that I'd had a really, really rough life and I had done this, this, and this, like I'm not sharing my trauma, but basically reframing theirs, would you be angry with me or would you be compassionate and kind towards me? And I found that it was always the latter. So it's taken time to find that, but it's how I feel, I suppose.
I will say that I did definitely connect with that as well. The actual idea of not being the actual the standards that you would set for yourself compared to others is actually quite a prescient part throughout this story. Like you show so much love and care to people who you're helping and going through surrogacy with, egg donation, and yet also on the flip side as well, when you talked about your own domestic life, it's a flip. And I mean, we'll touch on this a little bit later because of the comparisons there. But I think there's a great last question I want to ask, which is actually also the story of putting this book together, because the first words before this book starts is, you say it right from the jump. You say, you write from memory. This is not a legal document. It is instead, it's your truth. It is the truth of your experience, and you call it from the jump. I tell it imperfectly because some memories are fractured and are still, you're still living with that. Out of curiosity, how did the process of working with Hawkeye actually come together? What was it like putting this book together? Because I imagine it, similar to journaling, it would have been a very hard, but also at the same time collaborative process, because it's as you say, it's your perspective, it's your life.
It was actually funny how that happened. The editor of Hawkeye, I knew in another life. And many, many years ago, she called me and she said, "I'd like to write your story," because she's a really brilliant writer in her own respect. And I started writing for her, and then was really naive and thinking, anyone can write a book, famous last words. And I realized that it was, to actually write something that's good takes a lot of time and craft and energy and effort and reading and editing. And I ended up starting to write my own story, and it took me years and years to sort of shape it and figure out what I wanted to do with it. But then when it came back, Hawkeye was born, and so when I started to resubmit it, she was somebody that I trusted with that. So I put it back to her. She actually didn't read it. It usually goes to a panel who read it, and she didn't actually read it until they'd already accepted it and edited it. So it was difference. She could see the difference between the very, very early versions and what's on page now. So Hawkeye's been really supportive. They've been really supportive of, I guess, my vision for what I wanted the book to be, and knowing that, a writer who loves the result of the work is, really going to work on putting it out there. And they've been really super supportive with everything. That's been a really great process with them.
Ad break time. Stop the podcast. Hey everyone, just thought I'd stop to let you know that today's episode is sponsored by PodPixels, the Trent Dalton of professional podcast platforms. Question, do you have a desire for a great podcast? How are you going to build it? What about the design work? Won't it cost a fortune? Fear not, for PodPixels is a simple, done-for-you website service built specifically for podcasts. They are here to deliver that professional look to your podcast to make it easier for listeners to find your show, and all for one great monthly price. From hobbyists to pros, PodPixels has you covered. Their team provides domains, website hosting, backup, security, and support, handling the full setup and making sure that your show is up to date and allowing you to focus on what you do best, podcast. With PodPixels, you can achieve your full podcasting vision. They are the ultimate one-stop solution for anyone looking to build an online home for their podcast. Check them out below in the show notes and tell them that Nick from Date with the Debut sent you. Thank you, PodPixels, for sponsoring the show. So let's talk about this book. Let's talk about this wonderful, beautiful story that you have crafted with Hawkeye. We're now at the part of the show where I like to ask an author to give their 1-minute pitch, and it's particularly hard for this story. But I now am here with you. What is The Beauty of Broken Things about?
I'm not sure if I've got a minute for you, but
that's fine.
Behind this perfect suburban life was years of violence. After she escaped, Melissa Sharman changed laws, founded an organisation, and brought 22 babies into the world. The Beauty of Broken Things is unflinching, humorous, and deeply hopeful memoir about what becomes possible when you change your pain into purpose. So I suppose the beauty of Broken Things is really what I wanted it to be. That from from things in life that we look at as broken can be, beautiful and magic. So stained glass windows, mosaic, even like the butterfly struggles with, after it comes out of a cocoon when it was once when it was once a caterpillar. Wildfires burn through forest and it ruins and devastates the landscape. But what is born from that is, green shoots of new life, and it gets rid of the old and it creates new. So I think I just really wanted to celebrate that thought that beautiful things can come from brokenness.
That's a beautiful summary, and wow. I finished this book late last night, and I had a very, very strong reaction to it just sitting in the dark in my bed. I've been very lucky to have had many wonderful people on this podcast, and even though they've been difficult stories, memoirs included, this has been I'll just say from the jump, one of the hardest books I've ever had to discuss. It's short story, but you pack this story, you pack it in big time with all of the things that you have gone through in your life. I mean, we kind of addressed it a little bit earlier, but I want to ask it a little bit again. What was it like revisiting these periods of your life? I mean, there's joy, but there's also some very dark times. What was it like revisiting that period in your life on the page?
Look, I think it was tough, but I would write it at times when I'd write some of the key scenes that were really dark and sad, I would, sit there and I'd play all the sad music, and I would read all the documents, and I would go to places that had memories, and I would, step inside that time and write from every raw piece, with writing it for me, not for everybody else. And then when that time was over, I would step out of it and, call somebody and go for a walk in nature and do, something just to physically sort of step out of, I guess, the funk that puts you in. But as a whole, it comes together. And I think that when you've got your eye on the greater picture, which is, the beauty that has come from all of those things, there's definitely a light at the end of the tunnel.
It's a good answer to that. And I actually also want to preface this to any listeners who might look at this memoir and look at the premise and the pitch and go, oh God, that's not for me. This is not a sad book. This is not a sad book. It is not depressing. It is not terrible stuff happens in this book, but that is not what this book is about. It is filled with love as well and humor, both in what you receive and what you give. This book has a great relationship with humor as well, both in moments of genuine laughter that made me crack up laughing, but also in moments of very, very intense honesty. I noticed kind of something that came through with this book. I've been very lucky to speak with people who doing this show who've overcome huge adversity. A few examples. I mean, Carly J. Metcalf with her book Breath. She spent so much of her life in hospital overcoming challenge after medical challenge after medical challenge after medical challenge. I was lucky enough to speak with Johnny Ruffo about his memoir before he passed away. And when I spoke with them, there was so much warmth despite the adversity. And there's a line near at the end of this book where you talk about whenever we experience loss, the future can feel like a gaping, massive black hole. But you had a bit of a moment where you realized that the worst things that had happened to you were the best things that happened to your character. It's such a big question to ask. Talk to me about reflection, writing reflection and reflection from these moments, because, I mean, reflection is core to this book. It leads to you, I mean, again, it leads to this title. What was it like diving into the chances to actually have reflection on these moments in your life?
I think it's something that comes with time. It's not something that necessarily is there, automatically. But I think when somebody is strong and kind and, resilient and they've got strength, I want to know what they've been through. And I think everybody has something in their life, and it's not something that can be compared to from one person's pain to another's. Everyone's got something. Unfortunately, that is life. But I think that you can reflect with time and see. And I think there was many moments that I've sat with people and I thought, if I hadn't gone through what I had been through, I wouldn't be who I am. I wouldn't have the wisdom, the strength, the resilience, the character, all of the things that makes me, I suppose. And particularly when I was sitting in front of my clients, who we were referred right after they'd got out of hospital with a suicide attempt, and they were in their blackest state when everything felt bad. And I could sit there with some understanding and some empathy and kindness towards them, but also show them that life can be better beyond what's going on. So I think that is the benefit of, ongoing reflection with time and the great things that have come out of it. And there has been plenty of great things that have come out of all of it that, sometimes you can't see the darkness, or you can't see the night, the light, unless you experience a night. It just doesn't show up the same way. And I think that you learn how beautiful joy is when you haven't had that. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's good to highlight that contrast. I think we'll start diving into this book because your story begins at age 15. You grew up in a very religious family, and it starts with an interaction with Brett Cowan, who would go on to murder Daniel Morecambe. And that event where it created a bit of a spiral for you in that moment. There was what if scenarios that played out in your head, particularly after his face was plastered all over the news. It was that whole situation was swept under the rug by the church at the time, and you didn't tell your parents. There was a telling line where you said you didn't tell your parents because they would blame you. Talk to me about that, because it leads to several moments, particularly later in the book with your ex-husband, Lucas, where it shows the challenges that women in particular have in these circumstances. You can, if you're a woman, you can speak out, but often it's not clear cut at all how people react to it. If anything, it often can make things worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when I was 15, I was very bright-eyed and innocent. I was from a Christian, wasn't like the average sort of 15-year-old today. I was, this was in the 90s, and purity culture was going strong, and I was from a very sort of sheltered life where I just was quite naive and very optimistic and bright. And I think that event put it into a bit of a tailspin for me, and it sort of interrupted everything that, all the plans that I had for my life, and I kind of felt quite out of control with it all. And as you can sort of see through the book, it ends up with a few, crazy events after it that are probably really unexpected. And I think that, when you're going through something like that, where at the time I thought my parents would have been told by the church, but apparently they were not. So, and we just didn't have those conversations. Maybe it was our family, maybe it was a lot of families, but we just didn't have deep, emotional, honest conversations. We just weren't that family, So we were taught to pack away all the hard conversations and not have them. And so me being 15 and sort of not having the insight or the emotional intelligence or the ability to be able to know how to carry that, I just didn't. I drowned, really. And I think for a really long time I carried a lot of guilt and shame about that, and particularly as I found out who he was just a few years later, and that what he had done, and that left with a whole lot of what ifs, which really deepened that shame as well. So, and I think that that's what happens when women, particularly, or anybody really, when you have really, really low self-worth, you may make decisions that you may not have otherwise made. And it caused me to probably make decisions that the young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, Melissa, who was very keen and optimistic about the world, probably wouldn't have made after that. So it is definitely a line of dominoes that came afterwards, and how one impact from one life event can impact all the lives after, unless there's a circuit breaker. So that was definitely a big part of that.
The circuit definitely continues, and I noticed cycles kind of really became a major part of this story. The whole idea of just feeling like you're going round and round and round and round. And I think there is a line later in the book where when they're talking about the cycle of abuse, there's a discussion of, well, some women also go after, particular men because that's if they grew up in a difficult household where abuse was very, very prominent and front and center, that's the only thing they know. You had one marriage, which we touched on very briefly, but then you met Lucas in this story. I really struggled hard with Lucas, all segments with him, I think. And you lay it out very, very matter-of-factly, which I appreciate that you did, because even though of course it is, you make it from the jump that it's your perspective on it, it shows the impact of his decisions, and his decisions. I mean, for a time I felt, across the story, I felt pity for him, that life had taken him down that path to think that that sort of behavior was acceptable. But that pity did not extend so far, and increasingly became a white-hot rage, because he chose not to change his behavior. He kept giving in to that element of power over you and his worst desires. And that, in my head, your partner is your best friend in my head and my heart, which I know. And I know that that's, it's not the reality of the world we live in. I know that, as you kind of say in the book, 1 in 3 women experience domestic violence. The idea but the idea in my head of losing yourself to your demons and taking it out on your best friend, that's unacceptable. That's upsetting. And there are several moments, when, you talk about how when your children also came into your life, where there was a moment where you even said, "Oh, I don't even want to be saved," because you want to keep that element of a family unit. But there was a cycle of violence. A puppy-faced apology, then back to violence. You describe it, survival, as like a waltz of repetition. You moved cities, multiple houses, and it just still continued. Talk to me about that cycle. Because there's also a particular moment where I think where you're told his ability to break that cycle, that circuit breaker, is difficult but not impossible. And I thought maybe that was why you stayed as long as you did. I mean, of course, you can speak more on this more than I can. Because the whole time I was screaming at the book, Melissa, get out, get out. But as you say in the book, it's not that simple when you're in it day to day and you're in that environment and you're also fighting yourself as much as this man.
I think nobody tells you that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to your abuser doesn't appear as an abuser. He appears as everything you ever wanted. And for me, that was, acceptance. And he'd been through stuff as well, so he didn't judge me for mine. And, and he sort of, it was probably not what I had chosen for myself, but it was, it was kind. And I think that it's really hard for women to reconcile, and I see it every day. I work currently as a domestic violence practitioner now, so I have women sit in front of me every day and tell me a lot of the same things, and it's quite tough. And these men or women, or the domestic violence can happen to all of us in so many different ways in relationships, that these people who are we can sort of characterize as villains for us, and are not just that. They've got moments of kindness, and they've got their own vulnerabilities, and they've got, they can be your confidant and your friend as well as your abuser. So both things can be simultaneously true at once. And I think many women, they say that that women in violent relationships, the average amount of times they leave before they finally leave is 7 times. And I think that's really quite true. And it just takes time, and for things to take stock, and for you to finally have had enough of it. And in the meantime, you try and fix, you try and repair, and you think that if you love more, or if there's something that you do or something that they can understand, then finally that will change. But ultimately it's down to them. And I think what changed for me really was that I looked at my children, and I realized that, a lot of women say I'm staying for my kids, but ultimately I chose to leave for my kids. And that was something that I had to do because I didn't want them growing up thinking that this was normal, that this was what love looked like, and I knew I wanted better for them. So it still wasn't easy. Like, I grieved for probably a year after I left, even though it was my choice to do so. And it wasn't something that came easy. It was really, really hard, but it was the right thing to do. And I think they call it cognitive dissonance, where your head feels one thing, your heart feels another, and you've got to make a choice. And, that was the choice that I made. And, people, there's so many stories out there that just talk about, the anger and the rage and then the leaving, and they think that's where the story ends. And the story is much more nuanced than that. It starts with the best thing that ever happens to you, and then it ends, after you leave. That is not when it's over. Often abuse goes far beyond that, and it, penetrates all parts of life. And, I wanted a story to tell that, the full picture of what, family and domestic violence looks like.
Absolutely. And not only that, that there's a great subtext around that as a society, we don't know how to deal with this. We really don't. There's a moment which kind of left me like open, my mouth was open when you kind of shared this abuse with a friend, and their response was, "Oh, that's terrible. What did you do to upset him? He seems so nice. Are you sure?" And this idea of talking about how a generous man in outside company can still be a monster behind closed doors. And the idea is that society can't comprehend that two conflicting truths can also coexist together, which I think was particularly, you know, I just kind of had a moment of like, this is messy and crazy. I also loved the when you it was explained to you what you were doing, and that was effectively you were suffering from white knight syndrome. The idea of being, I'm the rescuer, I'm the fixer, I can fix him. You've nailed it to a T with that, because at the end of the day, it comes down to him being able to fix himself as much as it is. He is an adult. He is responsible for his own actions as much as it can't be something that you can fix on your own. I loved when Lily stood up to him, and there's a great scene where you say she shouted at him and she was shaking, but she'd won. She was shaking and she was terrified, but she had won, and you realised that that was a key moment for you, and that it ultimately led to, you kind of became involved in kind of making changes to laws in Queensland. With Queensland State Parliament, you delivered a petition which contained over 100,000 signatures to Parliament around that the laws around family violence just don't cut it. And there's an amazing quote which I'd love to read for the listener about this situation that people who suffer domestic violence are in, because I think you nail it to a T perfectly with this. We are outgunned, not just by abusers, but by poor public education, inadequate guilt legislation, insufficient funding, navigating it in real time like one person trying to hold back a changing tide. You capture that, just how big it feels. It's such a big question, but I feel like I have to ask it because you've been stuck in this environment or in this world for a while. Do you think that we can actually get to any sort of point where you think we can deal with this? Because we don't know how to deal with this stuff, and we should.
Look, I have such differing opinions on that. I think depending on the day, and I had this conversation with some colleagues last week, and I remember, back when I wrote this and when I was campaigning for it, I just felt so much, I don't know, maybe anger, sadness, all these conflicting emotions. And like I said, it was like a wild horse. Either I rein it up and ride it, or it drags me along. And that was what I needed to do. And back then I was so optimistic. I thought that if we could, if society would just become outraged, and, they say one woman a week is killed. And, I saw something even on the television just yesterday. They said if one person a week was getting eaten by sharks, we would be outraged and we would be doing something about it. But domestic violence is different. And I think that for a long time I pushed and pushed and pushed, and sometimes it doesn't feel like the politicians will get up there and they'll have these big, powerful statements, but it feels like things don't change. And I read a story a few years ago, and it was like one of those old parables about, a youth picking up starfish, and the old man was saying, "What are you doing? There's thousands of starfish on this beach, and the tide's, going out, and they're all going to die." And he said, "You can't make a difference." And he picks up a starfish and he throws it into the water, and he says, "I made a difference to that one." And so every single day I work in a drop-in centre at a Westfield shopping centre. And we kind of joke that we're helping women, survive and escape while their husbands think they're buying tea towels. And we sit in front of them and we talk to them, and we hold space for their stories, and we support, and we help with housing and funding and police advocacy and law advocacy and all the things that we can do. And we can't fix this. I think that it's much bigger than us. I think, it's a mixture of politicians and, even men themselves stepping up and collecting their brothers and just having these conversations and a change in dynamics of respect. But what we can change, and that's, I think, what you have to focus on if you want to be able to have the strength to keep going, is that we can make a difference. And it might be in a small way, and it might be to a handful of people every day. But collectively, we can all do our bit and we can make change. And I'm still hopeful for that, even though, I know it's a really tough, huge issue.
That's a great answer to a very difficult question. And I appreciate that it is a bit of a difficult question, but you're absolutely right about, you'd be surprised how much collective incremental change is possible, particularly when everyone comes to a collective realization of, hey, this is a problem. We need to do something about this. And I think especially appreciate you highlighting that men are a very key part of this. Men need to get better at calling this sort of stuff out, and also need to get better at being there for each other. So those sort of extreme responses, the chance to actually listen is often the problem that men often face with each other. And I think that it's particularly, I think you make a great point that men need to really also make a step up in this regard as well. There's one last part of this novel, that I would love to talk about, and that is your entire journey with Egg Donation Australia and your life, as a surrogate. And it was inspired by a moment because you had your first child very young, and particularly because you grew up in that religious household, you often spoke about how you felt so impure about your own body, and that there was this idea around it. And then you had an interaction with a work colleague who was trying to conceive, and she had a moment where she said, this was the 7th time I tried to conceive and I had no luck, and in her head she didn't feel like a woman. And it was so, like, you had a moment where in your head you didn't feel like a woman because you were able to have children with no issues at all, but you felt awful because of the religious views around your body. And it kind of brought back to the whole idea that the women's bodies are so, I was chatting about this last week with Emily Gazzolo about how there's so much power that's kind of portrayed around women's bodies. Talk to me about how your decision to change that and then create Egg Donation Australia, it's one of the real joys and beautiful stories. There's a lot of difficult moments in that journey because, as kind of mentioned at the top, 23 babies, 14 families that you've been involved with. It's been a rough road for a lot of those families to get to those points as well. But it's also a huge amount of joy that has come from that. Tell me about that journey and that part of your life.
I think it started accidentally. Like it was, I was a brand new nurse, fresh out of nursing school, and I'd had a teacher who had quite inspired me to sort of look around and just to look into the impact that you can make. And with that sort of, I walked into the world of nursing, and I was quite new and, naive to it all. And when I came across that nurse who was in, teary, it just sowed a seed in me that it was something that I had never really understood, but I felt a huge amount of compassion and empathy for her. And I went home with curiosity, and I found lists of women, and I thought, I remember ripping out, I went a few weeks later and I found a piece of newspaper, and it was egg donor wanted. And I remember ripping that out and taking it to a colleague and said, how many people do you think would apply for something like this? And she said, hundreds. And I went, well, they won't want my eggs then. But I went home and I realized that the list was so big and so comprehensive, and people waited years. And I was 27 and I had a couple kids already, and, was quite happy with my family. I'd finished it. I didn't want any more children. And it was kind of like, well, why not? Why not? It's something that I have. It's something that I can give, and it's something I can do. And I reached out, and I was really touched by her resilience and, her 13 years of trying to conceive in every single way, and they'd finally got to a point with an egg donor, and it had so many disappointments, but she kept going, and her positivity was really, really inspiring. And we went through that process, and she called me one day, and I still remember I was in the car, and she said, "I'm pregnant." And it was one of the, defining moments. I was like, this is so good. It was just so much joy for her and so much happiness for her. And I think that it's really underestimated. Like, we might be just donating an egg, but these are women that you get to know and you choose and you build a relationship with, and you really care about the outcome and you're really invested into that outcome. And as I sort of got into the egg donation world, I realized it was, there's a lot of complexities into it. And it was, back then in 2008, it was a subject that people didn't really talk about. Things have changed now with social media, but back then, IVF, fertility struggles, they were really taboo, and I think a lot of women felt very isolated. And so I got into the world of it, and then started Egg Donation Australia out of finding a need and realizing there wasn't much out there to help. And it wasn't something that was really clear to me to do. It was just that no one else was doing it, so somebody had to. And I found through helping others and watching their resilience and seeing their joy and their hope that it gave me a lot of hope. Like, it was like a bit of a lighthouse, when I was a boat drifting towards a bunch of open rocks and I was in trouble, and it kept me on. It kept me, spurring on to see. It was the happiness in my darkness, I suppose. And without knowing it, it's sort of, nearly 20 years later, it's been a really pivotal part of my life. And, that's a lot of egg donations and 3 surrogacies later. And, I just had one of my first surrogacy family come and stay with me last weekend. And, I often see their mums, and we're all still in contact, and they're just lovely people. And, I chose really lovely intended parents who are now, have a bunch of teenagers, and no returns. That's it. When they're naughty, no returns. No. And they're just lovely people, and it's just a beautiful world to be able to, I feel really privileged to be able to witness them and them grow up and become, beautiful families that they are. And it's just been such a source of joy. I mean, there's been tough times with it, but, so worth it. So worth it. One of the best I've ever done.
I will say, like, it definitely feels like the lighthouse in this story, because those moments are so wonderful and so filled with the change that you feel, that you make towards these people's lives, is beautiful, and it's infectious for the reader as well in this book, because and also the fact that it's held by the extra weight of that these are real people. These are people whose lives you changed for real in real life. There's so many great stories here, but I think the one I I wish I had time to focus on, but I really want to focus on Teresa, because you were a surrogate for her, and that was a particular journey as well. Tried many times. She couldn't conceive a child. I think it was a blood clot disease that she had, which meant that she couldn't actually carry a child, and she was desperate to have a child. And you guys went through many the journeys of it. Tell me about that one in particular, because I will say, when you got very close to her, and particularly within your own life as well, there was a whole element of back and forth where they talked about how they also came and saved you as much as you saved them.
Very much. That was very much true. I think that it was at a time when I really it gave me hope and purpose when I just didn't really have it. And I was so invested in the stories that it kind of, it carried me through in times where were really, really dark. So it was a huge part of my life.
I was going to ask, I have so many questions to ask about the book, but I know that, we're running out of time. I want to ask instead, and it's a question that, I often like to ask readers at the end of a podcast. What did this exercise, the exercise of writing the beauty of broken things, putting it onto a page, putting it out there in the world, what did it teach you? What did doing this in the context of your life, what did this exercise teach you, be it personally, as a writer, whatever?
I think it taught me a lot of things. It taught me that I can set my mind to a project that's really, really hard. And there was a lot of setbacks. It wasn't, it's not as simple as you think it is at the beginning, where you just write a book and someone picks it up and it's done. It's a lot of persistence and trying. But it also gave me a lot of self-worth individually, and realizing that, I have a lot to offer the world, and that that the care that I take on a day basis, and the kindness that I can show other people was the kindness that I needed back then, and how much it matters. So, I think it's taught me a lot about my own strength. And sometimes you don't actually even see it all together until you see it all together, and you're like, oof, when did that happen? But yeah, you get there, and it's, I'm really, really proud of the book, and I'm really proud of the story that I've put out there. And I'm, it is at times, it's daunting, it's raw. You're putting out just all your inner truths out there to the world, and, for other people's observation. And I think there comes a point where you're just quite accepting of who you are, and what people think of it. It just is what it is. And you're really happy, and it's really found a self of, my self-love and some self-acceptance there as well about this. This is my story, and I'm really proud of it.
You should be really proud of it. It's a wonderful book, and it's the fact that it's out there in the world. I'm glad that there's a book out like this out there in the world, that is doing good and telling stories and being that lighthouse in the darkness. And as you kind of correctly mentioned in the book, I'm not surprised that it made you realize, I think it was one person says you take one step and do another step, and then you don't realize how far you've come, and you traveled a lot of ground with this book. Will you write again?
I've already written book 2, and I'm like halfway through book 3, so I'm still working on those. I'm really excited now that the book's out there. I can really get back to reading and writing, which I've really missed, because putting a book out there is a lot of work. So I've got a few other side projects going on as well, so just keen to get back to it.
That's so exciting. Like non-fiction or fiction, or like anything. You're just kind of diving into the world.
Yeah, the second one that I've written, I've probably got another 20,000 words to sort of add on to it in my second edit, but it's a non-fiction book, and particularly geared towards, donor conception and the idea of kin and relationships. And it's sort of a lot of a case study, narrative non-fiction, but with a research element, I suppose, to it as well. And the third one is a contemporary fiction book as well, probably literary fiction. So, yeah, we shall see.
Hey everyone, Nick here. I'm excited to announce that I've launched a brand new book newsletter featuring book reviews, recommendations, latest news from the publishing world, opinion pieces, short stories, and more. One monthly newsletter, no spam, just the good book stuff. The sort of email you're glad shows up in your inbox. Sign up now for free, and for a small additional monthly fee, get early access to Date with the Debut episodes and exclusive content, including special extra episodes with our guests, Second Date, where they run another gauntlet of rapid-fire questions. Subscribe to my newsletter in the show notes below. We finish this podcast with a rapid-fire question part of the date, where to kind of put a lighter tone on it, I give you a bunch of questions and fling them at you, and you give me the first answer that comes to your head. Are you ready, Melissa?
Yes, let's go.
First and foremost, I'm very glad to hear that you now have, you're doing more writing, you're getting the chance to do a little bit more reading as well. Let's talk about book reading habits. What's your favorite book, first and foremost, that you have read in the last 12 months?
Probably one of because I've been reading in genre for a while as I've been writing, but Know My Name by Chantel Miller, I think, has been one of the ones I've loved. But I've read one by Dylan Hardcastle called The Language of Limbs, which is another one that stands out. And Yeah, there's some. I read so many books, and there's so many great books out there.
Dylan's book is wonderful. I think such a beautiful writer, and such a beautiful journey. I'm so glad you've shouted that particular book out. What is your favourite novel? Oh, sorry, favourite debut novel rather, that you've ever read?
Ooh. Oh, I've read so many of them recently. It's a big question. It's really hard to say because I've loved so many of them for different reasons. I'm in the 2026 debut crew, so literally I've got piles on the bedside table with where I'm reading probably trying an hour and a half a night, just trying to get through them. And there's been some beautiful books this year, and it's really hard to pick a favourite. There's just so many ones that I've liked for different reasons. So.
That's all right. I mean, if in your defense, I've kind of been in a similar headspace because so many of that debut crew have also approached me with books that they've done. So I am sympathetic to the fact that you've also got to pick a particular one. Oh, but yeah, that you've got so many that you need to pick up on.
It's just different for different ways. So, like the most recent one I've read is Lorena Oates' Solid Mum by Choice, which was actually quite an interesting book for me. Like she's beautiful at storytelling, but it was also has the fertility element to it. So that was the most recent one that I've just finished. So, but there's been quite a few. Quite a few on my to be read list, which is probably a question for later, but I've got about 6.
Guilty as charged.
Oh God, I'm getting there.
We didn't mention, obviously, in talking about the book originally, you've got a wonderful, beautiful new family now. You found a lovely hubby, Mal. You have obviously the children, his children, you all live together. Did they read the book, and what did they think about it?
My husband read the book in one day. I don't think there was many secrets for him in there, but I think he had a few questions after because he's understood stuff in theory, but then it's been a real, it's insight into his wife, isn't it? So I don't think any of the kids have read it. Look, I think my book would fit outside their 30-second attention span of scrolling TikTok. So, but it's there. They might.
I mean, it's fair. It's so nice to know that Val read it in one day. What a good egg. Because it also at the same time I also can imagine you going like, that took me years to write, and you just devoured it in a day. It's the highest compliment you can receive, but also like,
I actually kind of love it because I feel like if people can get through it, because as much as I hate to say it, as a reader, you really have, especially when you've read a lot, you have a high bar. So sometimes you find books and you'll struggle and you'll read a little bit of it and you're like, oh, I've really got to finish this one, but it's really hard. So I find it's quite the ultimate compliment when so many people have said, I've picked it up and I finished in a day.
Yeah,
so
couldn't stop.
There's something that continues wanting them to turn the page. So
yeah, and it's such a high compliment. This is a bit of more of a professional question, but also in connection with this book, because there's so many moments where so many people talk to you and offer amazing pieces of advice when you're in the situation that you're in. What is the best way to approach someone when they approach you and they say, I'm suffering in a domestic violence situation? How do you respond to that? What's the best way you can respond to that?
We get women in our office every day who they know that life at home is unhappy, it's uncomfortable, they're miserable, and they know that what is before them is uncomfortable, but they're afraid of taking the leap. So all I can really say is listen, support. If offer to be there, offer to help with resources when and if they're ready. But ultimately, I think women have to make their own choice about when they're ready. And it can be, for friends, especially when something's going on for a long time, it can take a bit of a toll on them when they're really wanting better for a friend who won't choose it for themselves. And, which is why with family and domestic violence, it's a shameful issue and people hide and they keep it hidden. So all I can really sort of say is listen, hear, be seen, let them know their worth, let them know you're there, and if they need help with resources, provide those and help them. But, it's got a choice that they've got to make for themselves.
That's a great answer to that question. I appreciate that. You grew up in a very religious family. It took you down a lot of difficult paths in life. Out of curiosity, where does your heart sit with religion right now?
Look, it's really complex. There's also parts in the book that ended up on the cutting room floor that explain why. I would say at the moment that, I have probably a complicated relationship with faith, and I think I look at it more as faith rather than religion now. And I think that I would rather live a life where I'm a good person and I am kind. And I think, for a lot of people who are, religious or would identify as Christian, that, there is a lot of elements out in the world that makes, there is a lot of, anti-LGBTQI and a lot of, anti-immigrants sometimes. There's a lot of really fearful responses on things that's obviously not all, but it's definitely out there. And I think that I feel like I've got to live a life that's true to me and that feels authentic and honest. And I guess I'm at a point where I don't know, and I'm still open and exploring, but it's complicated is all I can really say on that.
That's fair. And look, I think faith, distinction between religion and faith, I think is a very good headspace and approach to take. I grew up in that sort of similar environment where religion was very front and center. And, often you have to do that sort of separation to find your own personal kindness in that environment. And there's a great quote you actually mention where you say, no one can be whole without being broken. That sometimes being broken is the journey in growth and discovery, which is true. It is 100% true. What would you say to younger you now? If you had younger you in front of you right now, what would you say to them?
I think that I would probably reassure younger me that life's going to be okay. That young girl who was full of fear and shame and all the things that had gone wrong and not knowing where she fit in the world, that things have a way of working themselves out exactly like they're supposed to be. And there's a lot of hope out there and there's a lot of good out there. And also advice, for my younger self, I would probably say love yourself first. If that would be the advice that I'd give to my younger self, because I think when you care for yourself and you love yourself and who you are, everything else falls into place. So
that's a fantastic answer to that question. Pivoting away slightly to lighter topics, do you have a favorite word?
Favorite word? Hope. Got a tattoo.
That's a great. Oh, nice.
I do. I've got EDA's old motto, the gift of hope, on my wrist. So, yeah, hope is a big word for me.
Love it. What did Mal think of the line that I have more baggage than Qantas? Because I'm not going to lie, that whole page about you talking about getting onto dating sites was hilarious.
He's a good guy. And I was like, I remember when I started dating and I was like, oof, I didn't really want to date. I just got asked to go out with 5 nice young men and I was like, this is a goalpost. There's 5 nice young men. And just like, all you have to do is have dinner with them. And I had such a low bar, honestly, for men at that point. I was just like, I just want somebody who's not going to send me any dick pics and someone who could hold a conversation. And that was it. So it was more just that I don't back away from a dare and I was, going to go and have dinner. So at the beginning, I wouldn't even tell him my last name because I was like, don't Google me. But I can imagine sitting with a date and going, oh, by the way, I have a whole bunch of biological children and I have a, crazy ex-husband and I have, this all of these elements of stuff that you're like trying to explain to somebody who's thinking about engaging in a relationship. And to his credit, he just took it with, the confidence that he does. And he was just like, you do you, babe. You go be fabulous. And Yeah, that hasn't changed. He's great. Like, he just loves me as I am, and I love him for who he is. So it's it's a relationship that's very safe and accepting. So,
Well, and this leads nicely onto my last question that I can ask, and I often ask this question as an endpoint to the podcast. But in this particular case, I really want to know: are you happy?
oh, happier than look. Life is good, and I think that having that darkness has also filled me with a sense of gratitude as well, of how much I have in my life. And I have such great kids and a great husband and a job that I really love, and I get to ride, and I have some great friends, who are my ride and dies. And life is good. And I think that it's not just that life is good. It's just that through gratitude and through hard times, you learn to dance in the rain. And nothing's really that bad, really. Like, I haven't got really a whole lot to complain about. Life is what you make of it, and sometimes it takes a while, but you get there. Yeah, so I'm very happy. I feel a lot of joy.
Melissa Sharman is happy. Melissa Sharman is all right. That is all I need to know. And I'm really, really, really happy because I got the chance to chat to you about this beautiful, wonderful, intense, but ultimately incredibly rewarding and resilient story, the beauty of broken things. For everyone listening, I strongly recommend you go and get a copy of this. You can get a copy down in the description. You can get a copy at your local bookstore. You can get a copy at your local library, wherever you can get it. There's many places you can get it. Melissa and I are about to go and do a recording of a second episode called Second Date, which you can check out on my local newsletter, at my newsletter, about where we talk about her reading habits, a couple more elements of the story and of this book. You can check that out in the description. But for the meantime, Melissa, thank you so much. It has been an absolute joy talking with you about this wonderful book. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Date with a Debut, and for listening to the Words and Nerds channel. You can buy all books mentioned in today's episode down in the description box, and if you enjoyed the show, drop us a review, leave us 5 stars or a thumbs up wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to hear episodes when they drop, be sure to subscribe to Words and Nerds, or you can subscribe to Date with a Debut on Podbean to hear the latest episodes as they drop. This episode was edited and produced by myself, Nick Wasiliev. Additional production credits to Danny V from Words and Nerds, music by Shakira HZ, and thanks to the publishers and authors who make this show possible. This show is sponsored by Podpixels. Date with a Debut is a Words and Nerds and Breathe Art podcast co-production, recorded and edited on the lands of the Awurungal people.